the government themselves have in the past acknowledged this detrimental impact of mask wearing on our children. Their previous guidance in 2020 had said that masks in the classroom could have a detrimental effect on children's ability to learn and communicate. Boris Johnson had said that it would be nonsensical for children to wear masks in classrooms. And more recently, Jonathan Van Tam acknowledged that actually it was very difficult for children to be wearing masks in schools. So with all of that in mind, coupled with the very limited evidence for any efficacy in an education setting, it's very confusing to me why at this point in the pandemic, with 95% of adults having antibodies to the virus and all adults having been offered 3 doses of a vaccine, why the government is still turning to more restrictions on children than adults are living under. It seems disproportionate and inequitable, and frankly, it's also hypocritical because the adults making the rules are not themselves having to live their lives wearing a mask for 7 hours a day in their offices or in their workplaces.
Well, commentators are saying it's specifically to tackle the problem of staff absences. We know that people who've retired from teaching have been asked to come back to the coalface because staff absences really does impact children's education. I wonder if I can get your comment on the support for mask wearing in secondary schools in England from the 4 main teaching unions covering England and Wales and Northern Ireland. That's the ASCL, the NAHT, the NEU and the NASUWT, plus the GMB and Unison have all issued a joint statement saying schools needed it to avoid exam disruption for the 3rd successive year, remove uncertainty and additional workloads for students and teachers, and masks in secondary school classrooms are overdue. What you're saying seems to be at odds with the main teaching unions on this.
Yeah, so I sympathise with the issues in terms of isolation, but that really to me is a separate issue. I'm not hearing any compelling case that connects mask wearing in classrooms with a reduction in educational disruption. And in fact, in Scotland, children have been wearing masks in classrooms for over a year now. And I don't see any discernible difference in the trajectory of the pandemic or the disruption in schools and classrooms compared with England, where masks haven't been mandated in classrooms since earlier in the spring. So while it may seem comfortable to people to be seen to do something, just because we're doing something doesn't mean that something is actually going to have an effect. And what I find quite troubling about all of this is that whenever we have to reach for any measures, those measures are invariably directed towards the most powerless people in society, which are children, because actually children don't have very much choice about what they do in schools. If they're asked to wear a mask, they'll be wearing a mask for 7 hours a day. This guidance actually states that this extension of the mandate to classrooms doesn't apply to adults, so it doesn't actually apply to teaching staff. It only applies to children. So to me, this seems that we're not following the science at all. What we're following is the politics that has continually put adults first during this pandemic and has put children last. And actually children have been least affected throughout this pandemic, yet they continue to bear more restrictions than adults do. And I think that's a topsy-turvy way for us to approach our societal contract with children. And I think that it's frankly wrong, and it's disingenuous of the Education Secretary to say that he thinks this is going to stop school closures, because actually the opposite is true. This will increase anxiety and is more likely to lead us to more disruption in schools.
I hear what you're saying, and you make your point very well, but I suppose a bit of common sense in all this is if you've got 30 kids crammed into a classroom, often in very tight buildings where space is short, it makes sense, doesn't it, for them to wear masks. I mean, you're right, masks don't cut out the risk of spreading the Omicron variant or COVID very much, but it's a numbers game, isn't it? It cuts it down a little bit. You try and blow out a candle with a mask, it's very, very difficult. And you were talking earlier about communication being the primary concern here. If the teacher's not wearing a mask, but the kids are, that's the right way around, isn't it? The teacher needs to be able to explain to the class what the lesson is and explain through all the points. They don't necessarily need to be wearing the mask, but the children who are generally quiet in that setting would. Isn't this just about common sense, and isn't it worth trying?
Is that our aspiration, though, for our children, that their educational experience is that they're sitting silently, simply absorbing what they're being told, and not communicating? You'll notice that in the House of Commons, when an MP stands up to speak, they take off their mask because they recognise that actually it's more difficult for them to make their point while they're wearing a mask. So I'm afraid I don't see education as a teacher broadcasting to children, and I'm sure many teachers would agree. It's about a whole communication experience and a dialogue between teacher and children in the class. And I think this is a regressive step if we see that actually communication itself is a nice to have in the classroom. And we've seen this throughout, is that, schooling, in-person schooling, was described by various stakeholders, including members of the government and the chief medical officer, as a benefit. Well, schooling is actually a right for children. And in the same way, communication in a classroom, not a nice to have, it is an essential component of the education experience. So I think we've actually got all of this back to front now. And I really think it's incumbent on the government now to share their evidence, share their working for this, because I fear the workings for this is simply the Education Secretary capitulating to union demands without actually referring to the evidence at all. So I'll be watching that with interest to hear what is actually said about what's changed here, because at this point in the pandemic, this seems to be completely unjustifiable to me.